but we're cool now. Yeah. So this morning we're starting a new study that I'm calling Studies from Ezekiel. The reason I'm calling it Studies from Ezekiel is because we're not going to do the entire book. Chapters long, which makes it the fourth longest book in the Bible in terms of chapters, but if you count words, it's the second or third. And so doing a detailed study of Ezekiel would take us 2 years. And I don't want you to lose patience with me, and I'd like to live longer than that, so we're not going to do that. We're also not going to do an inductive study on this. I like inductive studies. It's my favorite type of thing. But I don't think it's as particularly helpful in a prophecy or a historical book. Really good in looking at the letters of Paul and John in the New Testament, but not in this area. So what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be taking a very thorough introduction, and we're going to, when we get done with that, I'm going to pick roughly 12 topics out of Ezekiel that we will study in detail so that we'll get the flavor of the book. So hopefully when we get done with this, you'll all have a pretty good understanding of what this book is all about. So before we get started, let's pause for a moment and have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for the day, the blessings that you brought to us, and that you gave your Son at Calvary on our behalf. May we always be mindful of the grace that we've been given and the faith that we should have in you and the service that we should offer. We ask that you would bless this congregation and its service. Bless those in the congregation who serve, our ministers, our elders, our deacons, and those who are teaching and taking care of just operating the congregation. Bless us in our outreach to this community that we can hold up your gospel. In the name of your Son, we ask it. Amen. Okay. I have a new template. So I finally found one that I halfway liked. So I'm interested in making sure that you can read it. I don't care so much if you don't like my choice of aesthetic there. Those are details. I'm more concerned about, can you read it? So if you have problems with that, tell me. And if you want me to try something different, give me another template and I'll take a look at it. But, you know, I found a whole boatload of these guys online. I'll tell you a little bit more about it at some other time. So, administrative note. As is my custom in teaching, all PowerPoints and notes for this class will be available via Google Drive. What I basically do, the material that I prep to present to you goes in a folder on Google Drive, and you can have access to that. And the way that you do that is you send me an email to my email address, j6collier@gmail.com, and I will email you a link to access the folder. Let me show you what this looks like. This is an email request that I sent from myself on one of my email accounts, and basically it has in the subject Ezekiel, and the text is, dude, where's my link? So if you want to send something a little humorous and sarcastic or snarky like that, I will try to respond in kind. But you're free to do with it whatever you want, and that will be updated weekly. So very, very easy. Okay, the goal of this course is to provide an overview of Ezekiel to set the stage for a study of the book of Revelation. Congregations that I have been part of in the past that have studied Revelation followed this same path, which is, if you want to understand Revelation, you kind of need to understand Ezekiel and Daniel first. So if you like alliteration, just call this Richard's Runway to Revelation. So, because Richard's going to be taking Daniel in Revelation. And I'm doing Ezekiel. But once we understand the elements of these books and how they kind of work, you're going to see that Revelation has a lot in common with these other two books. And one of the advantages of studying Ezekiel and Daniel is we get to study these books in an actual historical context. So, I mean, these are written as part of, this is what happened in Israel and that kind of a thing. So, and that's going to help us. So why study Ezekiel? First of all, it's an inspired book set in a crucial time in Israel's history. If you're familiar with your Old Testament history, this is when the wheels come off, pretty much. I mean, you know, they've gone as far as they can like this, and this is a situation that God cannot allow to persist, and so, you know, bad things are about to happen. Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation have common characteristics. Visions. Visions are a big part of all three books. The use of figurative language. Not everything in these books is intended to be interpreted literally, so it helps to understand how they're used in Revelation, it helps us to understand how they're used in Ezekiel and Daniel. All three books have an emphasis on judgment. This is what judgment is going to look like. And there are some common characteristics of the way people respond to judgment that we're going to kind of learn from these books at the same time. So the class is going to consist of a thorough introduction followed by selected topics from the book. When I say thorough introduction, I have never written an introduction like this. This is going to take us 3 to 4 weeks to get through, and the reason I have chosen to do it this way is because to understand Ezekiel, you have to understand the context. And the context that we would need to understand is the Old Testament history. Now, the congregations that I had mentioned earlier as having gone through this process themselves, they followed a pattern of let's study the Old Testament histories, and then we're going to study Ezekiel and Daniel and Revelation. We did our Old Testament history study in the new BC era before COVID, about 3 or 4 years ago. And we've changed, we've added a lot of people and things like that. So what I'm going to do for the bulk of the introduction is to go back and take the high-level view of all of this kind of a thing like this. So this is one of those things for the next 3 weeks. We're going to be going a mile wide and ½ an inch deep. Now, we don't have time to study it in detail, but we do have time to hit the high points, and so that's what we're going to do. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Not expecting any at this particular point, but, give you the opportunity. Context is essential. Ezekiel is set in a time of judgment. The nation of Israel is about to end its sojourn in the land of Canaan. Ezekiel is prophesying to Judeans who have already been taken into captivity. We'll look at the captivities in a little bit more detail and what's going on there. Ezekiel's audience doesn't necessarily believe or accept his message. And one of the things that kind of shows up in this book, and if you're looking at it, you'll see it's really obvious. They'll come to Ezekiel and say, Ezekiel, get us a message from God, and then not believe it, and then not do anything with it. Jeremiah, who's prophesying in Jerusalem at about the same time period, has exactly the same problem. So they're not, they kind of want to get a message, but they're kind of looking for the message to tell us something that we want to hear. And of course, in the historical context, they did find a whole boatload of prophets, quote marks there, who would tell them that various information. Tell us what we want to hear, not necessarily what they needed to hear. And so it's really important for us to understand how Judah arrived at this point. This did not happen overnight. So, but it's really a lesson, in an upper level perspective. What happens when we refuse to repent? Does it get better? And the answer is, no, it does not. So we're going to divide this study into 3 phases. What happened? And basically, this is the history, the dates, and all of this kind of things like that. The history of Israel from the Exodus to the fall of Jerusalem. This spans roughly 8 centuries, and I like to point that out because you and I can open our Bibles up and read this history of time dealing with this problem. They spend a lot of time provoking God to anger, and because we can read it in weeks, it's very, it's easy for us to interpret it as it happened in weeks. Well, it didn't. It took centuries to get to this particular point. And so, what did they do? How did they live during this particular time period? The second point, why it happened. This is the really important one. The history of Israel from the Exodus to the destruction of Jerusalem was not what God wanted for his people. That was never the plan, to take them out of Egypt and then take them into Canaan and then blow them out of Canaan in an act of judgment. So where did it go wrong? Kind of need to understand that. And then the third point is what God said about it through the prophets. Now, prophets are present in every phase of Israel's history. Moses was a prophet. When we get into the book of Judges, we're going to start to see prophets mentioned there. And then as we go further into 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and the history of the kings, we see more and more prophets mentioned there. But they had a specific purpose. They were supposed to be the spokespeople for God. So what do they have to say about this event? Because that's going to tell us what God thought about it, why it was done. Questions, comments? Okay. The history of Israel is rooted in the promise made to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. His descendants went into Egypt, became a large nation, and then they returned to Canaan. Most of us are really familiar with this passage. This is the New American Standard reading of it. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who you will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So the three promises are what? Land, people, and seed, if you use the old King James word. And I kind of like that in this context. Land, people, and seed. So going into Canaan is the fulfillment of the land promise, but he's going in as a great nation, which is a fulfillment of the people promise. But we're not dealing with the seed right now, other than the fact that it's coming. It's really important because they don't go back into Canaan after they get captivity without the seed promise. So that's important. That's really the whole reason for that. So those three things are what we're looking at here in an overview. The Exodus. The first challenge when we open in the book of Exodus is how to take this people out of Egypt, move them through a desert wilderness, and bring them to the promised land. There are challenges in the Exodus. They are crossing a desert wilderness. How many of you have ever driven across a desert wilderness? So you go around here on an interstate system, and how far is it to the next exit? 20 miles is a stretch, right? You in the desert, 60 miles, 80 miles, you know. And in some places, there's a highway in Nevada that's called the longest, loneliest highway in the nation, because they ain't nothing on that road for like 100 miles. The deadliest highway in the nation's in New Mexico between Tularosa and Carrizozo, 62 miles straight. Can you imagine sitting in a car and trying to hold it on the road for 62 miles? That's the way things are in a desert. Now, if you go in an American desert right now in New Mexico, Arizona, or southern Utah, there's a Walmart in every town. That's not the way it's going to be here for them. This is a desert wilderness. What do people need wherever they are? They need food. They need water. They need clothing. They need shelter. There's actually a plan to take care of all of those things, weren't there? That was part of, God was not caught unawares in this situation. Say, wow, I didn't realize I was going to have to feed 1 million people. Had that pretty much down. Grumbling and complaining. If you're familiar with the Exodus, that's, that was like their go-to response, wasn't it? Grumbling and complaining. Now, a lot of times we look at grumbling and complaining as kind of a venting operation. And generally when somebody starts grumbling or complaining to me, I try to interpret it from that perspective there, to let them vent it out and they'll all feel better, and then maybe it won't be so bad. But it's also a problem. It's a problem, because if that's your go-to response, then every time you hit a difficulty, what are you going to do? You're going to complain, gripe about it. I don't like this because, it's not cooked right, or, water's too warm, or, we can find something to complain about. So, it becomes a problem for them. A third problem for them was they were an easy target for raiders. Think about this for a second. You've got maybe 1.5 million, 2 million people crossing an open desert in a single file line, miles long. And if you're a desert tribe out there saying, I want to make a quick score here on something, hit them. They can't protect everything, so they have to, there is a challenge here to doing that they have to, again, compensate for. So the Exodus, in that sense, was not necessarily an easy event. It's a whole lot easier for you and I to cross an open desert today than it was for them. Maybe the air conditioning doesn't work right, and we'll complain about that, but it's a whole lot easier, way to do it. There was a plan to provide everything needed, both spiritually and physically. Yes, they need food, they need clothing, they need shelter, they need all of these supplies, but they also needed God, didn't they? And they needed, they needed to develop this relationship with him that God wanted them to have. So the first thing that they do after they cross the Red Sea is they make a line to Mount Sinai to get the law. After they leave Mount Sinai, the plan is to head north towards Canaan, when they get to Canaan, they don't get the whole land. There are large elements of the land that they do get, but there are other nations in there like the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites and things like that that are kind of like their kinfolk. You don't get any of their land, so you kind of have to steer a path around that, and then you go in and take the land. Easy peasy if you do it right, and they didn't. So what happened? At Mount Sinai, while Moses is up on the mountain getting the law, what are they doing? Golden calf, right? Yeah. Moses made it, or not Moses, Aaron made him a golden calf. Got all this gold, made a calf. Why a calf? Well, they were important in Egypt, you know. I don't know other than that, but it was wrong. When things got tough, they grumbled and complained. Now, think about this for just a second, just in general terms. You need something. It's a legitimate need. How do you go about getting it? Should grumbling and complaining be at the top of your list? No. Hey, prayer. You know? And it's not like God was unaware that they needed this, and I think part of the purpose of doing this was to teach them how to come and ask. You have legitimate needs. I have legitimate needs. If there's something that's amiss in that legitimate need being met, then maybe we should just try asking. And what happens then? Well, that builds faith, doesn't it? I think that was part of the purpose of what they're trying to do at. The third point, when they went to spy out the promised land, the spies went in there and they came back and they said, this place is great. It is everything God promised it would be, a land flowing with milk and honey. And oh, by the way, we can't take it because the cities are huge, they're walled, and they're inhabited by giants. So we can't get in there and take it. And they kind of decided, well, we can't take it, and so we're going to go back to Egypt. Get another leader to go back to Egypt, and God intervened there. And we know what happened, didn't it? They got to spend another 40 years in the wilderness, wandering in the desert. And over that next 40 years, an entire generation died except for Joshua and Caleb, and then their children entered the land. Moses and Aaron also died, and Joshua was the one who led Israel to take the land of promise. So that's the Exodus in a nutshell. Any comments or questions? Okay. Let's look at the next phase, the conquest. The goal of the conquest was for Israel to occupy and take control of the land promised to Abraham. There are people living there, and they're going to have to take the land from them. To do this, their mission was to drive out the current occupants or to exterminate them. Now, I'm going to say more about that when we get into the why this happened part of the lesson, but that's their mission. It sounds kind of brutal, and we'll talk about that. I promise you we will talk about that, but there was a reason for it. And then once they were in there and they'd driven out all the inhabitants of the land, they could grow into the nation that God wanted. So that's their mission. God did tell them that we're not going to do this like, in one big swoop, because think about this for a second. Who's going into the land? Not the generation that came out of Egypt, but the next generation, right? What do they know how to do? What's their life been? Walking around in the desert and pitching tents, right? They're nomads here. The generation that came out of Egypt, we know from looking at the Exodus accounts and things like that, they were heavily involved with building. I mean, they knew how to make bricks out of mud or clay bricks and things like that. They were enslaved. They had houses too, and they raised gardens and things like that. The generation going into Canaan doesn't really know any of these skills. Now, there's a way to get them. I mean, the first couple of times you try to grow a garden, it might be a miserable experience, and you're lucky to get 2 carrots or something like that, but you figure it out and you get better at it. So, they can do that. Building a house is a little more complicated. You don't want me to build your house. And I don't know what the code is. I don't know. I can get 2 boards nailed together and I can smooth out concrete and solder some plumbing, but you don't want me to build your house. Somebody else needs to do that for you. But they can do all of this kind of stuff. But God did tell them, not going to drive them out all at once here, so the land is not overwhelmed with brush or anything like that. And so you have time to learn to live in the land. But still, the mission is, got to get them out of here. Can't let them stay here anymore. Questions or comments? So the conquest. There were challenges to the conquest. Canaanite cities were large and well defended. Canaanite cities, as was the custom in that time, usually were constructed with a large wall around it. Why do you construct a wall around the city? Keep protection, keep the bad people outside of the city, control access to the city. Why don't we do that today? Because modern weaponry renders the wall useless. In fact, it's more of a hindrance than it is a help, because if you want to expand your city, you've got to start knocking this wall down. So that's why we don't do it today. Works really good in ancient times, though. So they're in these large, well-defended cities, and the way that Israel will have to attack the cities is they will have to lay siege to the city. Siege is an expensive, time-consuming operation. It's all about the logistics. Which side is going to run out of food and water first? You know, the outside in a desert country, you're having to forage. People inside the city have built up supplies. You know, who runs out first? And it's about the wall. If the wall is breached and you hold the breach, then you win. Israel had its entire population moving with its army. How many times did we deploy the American army and send our entire population with it? I mean, can you imagine storming the beaches of Normandy in June 1944 with all of these 250,000 American soldiers, and oh, by the way, there's 100 million people on boats offshore waiting to come in? You know, you talk about fat target right there. You know, that's, you know, we don't do that. We send them, we don't all go with them. But Israel has its entire population moving with the army, which still has to be fed and clothed and protected and all these other kinds of things. The third challenge is more of a long-term challenge. Israel has no experience operating a city-based or agricultural economy. Mentioned this earlier. They're really good at walking through the desert, pitching tents and things like that. They're in really good shape. You can't walk through the desert as long as these people did and not be in really good physical conditioning. So they've got that going for them, but they don't know how to do any of these things. They don't know how to build a house. And archaeology shows that, you know, some of the first houses around this transition time, the before and the after the conquest, the before was a really sophisticated building. The after was not so much, but they had to learn. Rick?
How did they deal with water supply? The ones inside the camp, did they have like an inside well or?
Well, yes. The answer to your question is in ancient times, you built cities on top of springs or places that you could get water. So Jerusalem was chosen for that specific reason. The ancient cities of Babylon and Nineveh and things like that were built along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers because that guaranteed them a water supply. And if you go out and look out in the west, they're doing pretty much the same thing. How many of you have ever driven through Albuquerque, New Mexico? Albuquerque, New Mexico currently has 750,000 people living within it. And if you look to the west of Albuquerque, you see the Rio Grande River, which in some days you could throw a rock across. They're not drinking that. They're on top of one of the best aquifers in the entire American Southwest. That's why there's 750,000 people living there. So it's the same principle. Israel does possess a significant advantage, however. The people living in Canaan do not appear to be united. How do we know this? Well, when Israel rolls up to Jericho and surrounds the city, who comes to help Jericho? Nobody. When they roll out of Jericho and go hit Ai, who comes to help Ai? Yeah. The first act of unity or consolidation with the Canaanites is actually when the Gibeonites come in and deceive Israel and they trick them into making this treaty. Then they all of a sudden unite and attack the Gibeonites. But they're not up, when they're first going in there, they're not a united people. And so that's an advantage that, to Israel as well. Questions or comments? Overall, the conquest goes well, and God promised them it was going to go well, and it goes this way. But there were problems. There was the sin at Jericho in Joshua 7:1 and following. When Israel was told to go in and take Jericho, they were told this city was under the ban or devoted to destruction, and this was a very precise term that meant You can't take any of the loot of the city. You don't take any of the animals, you don't take any of the people, you don't take any of the silver or the gold. And a guy named Achan did that. He took some clothing, he took some silver, and he buried it in his tent. And so when Israel leaves Jericho to go to their next target, they're pretty confident because these guys are kind of small. We don't even need the whole army to go up there and do it. Oh, by the way, we just got whooped. And they have to go back in and find that out, and they discover this particular sin. The deception of the Gibeonites in Joshua 9, 3 through 14, the basis of the deception of the Gibeonites is that they looked at the situation, and I give them credit for being this cunning. You know, these are some pretty smart people thinking outside the box. They said, we can't do this. So what we're going to do is let's get everybody, you put on raggedy clothing and worn out shoes, and we're going to bake some bread, and then we're going to let it set around, dry out, and mold, and then we're going to go in and we're going to talk to Israel, and we're going to say, hey, we're not from around here, but we see you guys are going to become a thing in this part of the world, and we would like to be your friends. And they accepted that. They didn't actually go back and ask or validate the story or talk to God or anything about that thing. So they were deceived, and then they found out these guys are right here. And then Israel was mad, and what are you going to do? You know, we're our allies. You know, do with us whatever you want, but we're going to get to live. Bob?
Yeah. How they found out that Achan had those, they cast lots. I don't understand the casting lots. Figure that out.
Think about rolling the dice. Think about, well, there's 12 tribes, so we're going to roll a 12-sided dice. And so we roll 4, and that comes up Benjamin. And then we think of the clans of Benjamin, and we roll it again, and maybe that comes up a 7, and that identifies a clan. And we keep doing that until we get down to the individual. That's what they're doing. Or you can think of, we got a whole handful of straws, and whoever draws the short one, that's the one that we're looking for.
Of course, God's involved.
Yeah, God's involved there. That's the one who's steering it, because they get to the guy. And in spite of all of the millions of people, the 12 tribes, the families, and all of these kinds of things like that, they get to the guy. And that's how we know God is involved. Okay. The third point on here is probably the most deadly of points on this. Israel does not fulfill its mission. Remember what their mission was with respect to the people of the land? Yeah, get them out of here. Drive them out or exterminate them. Brutal, brutal mission. But they didn't do it. And this is the thing that's going to put them ultimately onto the path of judgment in 800 years. So, this is their major stumbling block. So, any questions or comments? Barry?
Just a quick comment about going back to the lot, and this is a verse I reference a lot when I'm reading through the Old Testament because there's a lot of casting lots. Proverbs 16:33 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah, they're going to have the Urim and Thummim later on to do essentially the same type of a selection process. Gary?
As you're going through this, and I greatly appreciate it, it kind of reminds me, or I draw, and I don't know if it's correct or not, a parallel with the modern day Israel, meaning that God can still help them out and direct them in what they needed to do, to get some success or do whatever. So I'm not sure if that's a good parallel, but it seems to be kind of something that does kind of act in some concords.
Yeah. Well, God is sovereign over all nations. When you get into the book of Isaiah, Isaiah talks about the Assyrians, and he uses a particular term to describe it. He says basically they're a tool. They're doing the will of God, even though they don't know they're doing the will of God. I mean, what Assyria at that particular time was the instrument of punishment for the 10 northern tribes of Israel, the same way that Babylon will be the instrument of punishment for the, for Judah. In both cases, that nation was a tool. You want to cut a board, you get a saw. You want to drive a nail, you get a hammer. You can cut a board with a hammer, I mean, I suppose you could beat it into submission and get some kind of a break in there, but you're not going to get what you want out of it, and you can drive a nail with a saw. Again, it probably worked. We probably wrecked the saw in the process. So the right tool, right situation. Nations can do that. The other aspect, and they can do this without even being aware of it. That's true for all nations. The other aspect of this whole going into judgment thing that I find particularly frightening to me is their complete unawareness that this is going on. You know, Israel, the 10 northern tribes, when the Assyrians come to Colin, they know they're in trouble. I mean, these guys are here, they're large, they're powerful, they mean business, they know they're in trouble, and they're going to scramble around to try to stop it. When Babylon starts to come for Judah, they know they're in trouble. And they're going to scramble around and try to make treaties and do all these other kinds of things to try to stop it. But that wasn't the solution, was it? The pattern I think that we should see is the fact that, number one, they failed to fulfill their mission. And it sounds brutal. And like I said, talk about that a little bit more next week. But I think the thing to just think about this. Is there any indication in Scripture that God ever punished a nation that didn't deserve it? No. No, there's no indication of that at all. So when God says that this is what you got to do, it's because this is what they deserve. Another factor that I'm going to point out a little bit later and I'll mention is when Judah gets punished, they weren't the only ones getting punished in that day and time. And if you think about it a little bit rationally, it kind of makes sense, because what's going to happen if you take a nation and you put it in a land and it's surrounded by all of these pagan influences and things like that, and they don't correct themselves? What's going to happen? Coming on in, isn't it? Coming on in. We're going to adapt their customs. We're going to marry with them. We're going to do all of these kinds of things. Whatever's going on the outside is coming in. And so if Judah is taken out of the land and we take now a cleansed nation and bring it back in, put it in the same environment, what's the most likely outcome? We've already seen it happen, haven't we? Yes, Bethany?
We live in a time when it's, even within the church, it's unpopular to call sin sin.
Yeah.
And here we see God's attitude towards sin really strongly and how serious it is. And if we're the new Israel, as a metaphor, we're supposed to clean house too. You know, it just can't exist. They fell in their mission because of sin.
Yeah, they did, exactly. And the lesson for us is when God's telling us that we need to repent of something, what should we be doing? See, it's the holding on to it and sticking with this thing is the thing that caused the problem ultimately. They didn't do their mission. They didn't repent of some of the things, and instead you get comfortable with this, and then it's not enough, and now we're going to get comfortable with this, and so on. Yes?
It's interesting, on Thursday mornings we're studying Amos, and we just studied chapter 4. It said, I've done this, but you refuse to repent. I've done this, you refuse to repent. I've done this, you refuse to repent, or did not return to me. So the prophets are very clear why.
Yeah, it's not a mystery. It doesn't take a whole lot of intellectual insight in there because it's telling us that. Other questions or comments? See, we've already learned something. We've already made an application out of this thing that we need to take to heart. That's a good thing. So the consolidation. When Joshua dies, Israel effectively controlled the land that they had been promised. However, there are still areas that needed to be consolidated. And again, this was intentional so that the land wasn't overrun where they lost control of that and they would have time to learn how to operate an economy in that land. And at this point, Israel is a loose confederation of 12 tribes united by the law of Moses and the priesthood. So they have a common worship, they have a common place to worship, they have a law, they have priests who are distributed throughout the land. And go look at how the land is allocated, and you see there are 48 cities in that land that were supposed to be homes to priests, precisely so they could preserve the law out there. And however, their unwillingness to fulfill their mission, again, drive them out, exterminate, this allowed these other influences, and sin began to corrupt the nation. And so this led to repeated attempts to chastise and cleanse the nation. So this is the cycle of the book of Judges. The people fall away from God. So we'll have a generation that's trying to follow God, perhaps doing a really good job of it, but at some point they start to stray away because they didn't fulfill their mission. God allows the nations around them to subdue and punish Israel. Israel repents and cries for help. God sends a judge or a deliverer to drive out the oppressors. Lather, rinse, repeat. Yeah. Look at your shampoo bottle next time you wash your hair. That's what they're going to tell you on there. Just, I think ideally they want you to just use the whole bottle at one, at one setting there. Just because they don't ever tell you to stop, you see. Yeah. But that's what they're doing here. I got a handout that I didn't put out on the account, and I'm going to do this afterwards. That's a writing that I did on this for you. It's available online, and I would prefer that you get it there, but if you don't have access to online, I have 20 copies of this thing out there. I didn't put it out earlier because due to time mismanagement, I had to go to the UPS store to make these copies, and I'm still suffering from sticker shock at what I paid for that. That was expensive.
$2 a sheet.
No, it's like 27 cents a sheet, so it ended up being really expensive. I don't even want to mention the number because the first thing you're going to think of is what is wrong with that guy. But I'll put them on there back there. If you want one, take one. If you can endure the process of sending them an email and clicking on the link, get it that way because that one's color, this is not. But I have tables in there for like the judges and things like that, just the high-level judges. Kind of interesting to look at the history of that. I got some tables in there of the reign summaries of the kings of Israel and Judah, so you can kind of get a feel for what that was. If you look at the reign summaries of the kings, there's a reason why Israel goes into captivity, 100 years before, Judah does. Actually, a little bit longer, like 140 years. So I have that information. I also have this nice, very pretty, colorful timeline in there that I know you're just going to love. When you get a hold of it, and this one's black and white. But I will put these back there. If none of that qualifies to you, take them and go. So final point. Around 1200 BC, a new threat arrives in Canaan. This is the Philistines. They arrive and occupy the coastal lands along the Mediterranean, west of Israel. The Philistines were a seafaring nation that was facing its own problems. Archaeology suggests that they probably came from the Isle of Crete, which was having all kinds of issues and things like that because of a volcano north of there. But they were more technologically advanced and better organized than Israel. When I say more technologically advanced, they knew how to work iron. Israel does not. Israel is still working with bronze, and iron turns out to be a really good metal, and if you can infuse a little bit of carbon in there, you can make steel. And they know how to do this kind of a thing. Now, culturally, we in this country at one time used the word Philistine to describe somebody that we thought of as uncouth or uneducated or kind of a country bumpkin or a barbarian, of dubious moral character. The truth of the matter is that the Philistines were technologically sophisticated, they were better organized, had a better culture, and still of a dubious moral character, but they had all of these advantages over Judah and in Israel, and so they are a serious threat here. And one of the things that this is going to do is cause Israel to go ask for a king. Now, for next week, read the book of Ezekiel, preferably out loud, and yeah, I know, everybody's looking at me like, are you serious? Yeah. Break it up into manageable chunks, okay? You can break it up into 8 chapters per day for 6 days and read the whole book, and it'll take you about 20 to 30 minutes to read that chunk. If you read slow, then do 6 chapters for 8 days, because we're going to be in the introduction for a period of time. I find reading it out loud to be very helpful, so I recommend it. You don't have to do it. I'm not going to check up on you or call you out in class or anything on that, but I highly recommend it. Read the book. So might get through it twice before we actually get into the material. Okay, any other closing thoughts or comments? Appreciate your attention, and we'll come back for some more exciting history next week.
Thank you.